When people don't have access to the care they need, many suffer and some die, but not for the reasons you might think. Would it surprise you to learn that the leading cause of death for people during and immediately after pregnancy is not a complication of pregnancy or birth? Mental health struggles are responsible for the majority of these deaths. In fact, suicide, overdose, self-harm, and substance abuse kill pregnant people at nearly twice the rate as the leading obstetric emergency. The second leading cause of maternal mortality is homicide. The majority of pregnant people who die by homicide are killed by a current or former intimate partner, and the weapon of choice for more than half of these killings is a firearm. Relationship violence often escalates and can turn particularly deadly in two circumstances. One is when attempting to leave the relationship, and the second is pregnancy. Across the United States, an individual's risk of death during and immediately following pregnancy is highly dependent on where they live. States with the highest rates of maternal mortality also have the most restrictive abortion policies in the nation. Imagine you are trying to leave your abusive relationship when you discover that you're pregnant. What would this mean for your life? What would this mean about your connection to the person hurting you? Your future? What about your children? As a clinical social worker and sexuality educator specializing in abortion care, I meet with people in that exact situation nearly every day. People who know that having a child with their abuser would result in more pain, more trauma, and who are keenly aware that being in this relationship longer may cost them their sanity, potentially their lives. People like Jane. I met Jane at the time of her abortion. A single mom with a small child, Jane had been in her current relationship for just over a year. At first, it was wonderful. He was kind, charming, charismatic, and he really took time to earn her trust. Jane worked 2 jobs and still struggled to make ends meet. Seeing her struggles, her partner invited her to move in with him. His home was nicer than her apartment, and he made good money. She would easily be able to quit her second job and be substantially more comfortable. It just made sense. So she took him up on the offer. Jane's partner had been open about his struggle with infertility. So when her birth control prescription ran out, she didn't feel the need to renew it. A few months of living together had passed, and he convinced her that their household could survive on his income alone. She would be able to spend even more time with her child and maybe even go back to school. She was happy. Gradually, though, his insecurities began to show. He became irritated when she would receive messages. He began to question her about them. When she would leave the house without him, he'd accuse her of cheating. These accusations led to yelling and insults. It didn't matter where she went or why. When Jane got home, she would have hell to pay. So, she left the house less and less. And for a while, this helped reduce his outbursts. One day, though, she had to leave the house, unexpectedly. Upon returning home, the accusations began. He became so angry that he punched a hole in the wall next to where Jane was standing, just inches from her head. She was in shock, and for the first time, truly scared of her partner. Despite her fear, Jane held out hope that things would get better. And they did, until something else would set him off. And it could be anything. He would scream, call her names, even made her question her own perception of reality. She was walking on eggshells. She remembered the kind, caring person he was at the start of their relationship, and more than anything, she wanted that back. When Jane discovered she was pregnant, she was terrified about what his reaction might be. But to her surprise, he seemed to already know. Something wasn't sitting right with Jane, so almost instinctively, she peeked at his phone. When she did this, she discovered, to her horror, that he had been tracking her cycle for months. She felt betrayed. She didn't want to have a baby, not with him, not because of a lie. His temperament drastically changed. He took complete control over her finances. He would come by the house at unexpected times throughout the day, just to make sure she was still there. He made threats, and while she was unsure if they were just intended to scare her or if he would act on them, she certainly didn't want to find out. And for the first time, the abuse became physical. Jane worried about how much worse things could get as the pregnancy progressed, not to mention after the baby was born. She could not let that happen. Jane lives in one of the 14 states where abortion is completely banned. It would take her more than 4 hours to drive to the nearest clinic. She would need someone with her to drive and to watch her child. And on top of this, she had very little money. She considered ordering abortion pills by mail. This would allow her to have a miscarriage without even leaving the house. While self-managed abortion with pills is medically safe, it is not without legal risk. And Jane could not risk him getting to her package before she did. So she called a clinic, our clinic, and scheduled an appointment. She wound up rescheduling multiple times before she was finally able to leave the house without him noticing. This prolonged her pregnancy. Jane's abortion came as a relief. Abortion funds helped her pay for medical care and travel expenses. Funding organizations like those that supported Jane are currently experiencing scarcity and are struggling to support others to the same extent. During her visit, I was able to connect her with a local domestic violence agency. They provided temporary housing and counseling. Though Jane had a long road of healing in front of her, she felt free. Jane's story is incredibly common, so common that I hear a different version of it almost every day. Jane's story is based on a collective experience shared by hundreds of survivors who have entrusted me with their stories. One thing that they have taught me is that when pregnancy occurs in the context of violence, it can be devastating. Each day, I am confronted by the fact that 1 out of every 3 cisgender women and more than half of transgender people experience relationship violence in our lifetimes. I think about the people I don't see, like Jane, those in dangerous situations who don't get the care they need. We know that when people are able to get the abortions they need, they experience rates of ongoing violence that are less than those who are unable to end their pregnancies. And to make matters worse, even when violent relationships do end, biological ties afford abusers legal rights. Oftentimes, these rights are used as a means to further torment their victim. As a survivor myself, I fundamentally understand what it is like to have my autonomy my very humanity stripped away. As a clinician, I know that the best way to support survivors is to restore their agency. Throughout my career, I have worked with survivors of domestic violence, sexual assault, stalking, human trafficking, and kidnapping. I have held the hands and wiped the tears of many children and teens, some barely 12 years old, as they've had abortion procedures. For many of the folks that I see, abortion is part of their healing. Roughly 1 out of every 4 people capable of pregnancy will have an abortion in our lifetimes. Yet it remains stigmatized, sometimes even criminalized. Few people feel comfortable enough to be open about these experiences. And it's the same stigma that harms survivors. Too many of us are too ashamed of what is happening or too isolated to seek help. Survivors of violence are more likely to experience homelessness, end our own lives, and have an array of physical and mental health issues as a direct result of traumatic stress and physical violence. Sometimes, we choose to live in silence. It feels safer than risking judgment when we need compassion the most. As a society, we do a terrible job talking about things that make us uncomfortable, typically avoiding them at all costs. When these topics do come up, we polarize them to the point that nearly everyone has an opinion, but few feel comfortable listening to the most affected. Lack of discourse leads to lack of awareness and lack of opportunities for help. It implies that there is something shameful about these experiences, and shame festers. So, what can we do? Well, most of us don't have endless resources or large platforms. We all have a very powerful tool at our disposal, a tool that allows us to break the silence and to draw attention to these issues of life and death. We each have a voice. We can start conversations. We can share information and resources. We can plant seeds of empathy and understanding amongst each other. Creating a dialogue can make someone feel comfortable enough to reach out for support or to simply know that they're not alone. We can make a difference in the lives of those around us, starting a chain reaction. Even if you don't know it yet, every one of us loves someone who has suffered from relationship or sexual violence. And every single one of us loves someone who has had an abortion. Together, we are unstoppable. Cultural shifts start small. They start with difficult conversations. This conversation, it starts with us. Thank you.